Welcome to the Sage Family Podcast, where we explore natural homeschooling, gentle parenting,
simple living, and family adventure.
I'm Rachel Rainbolt, the Sage Family Mentor, coming to you from an island in the Pacific Northwest, where I live wild and free in connection with my hilarious husband and 3 growing sailors in our fixer-upper on the beach. So join us around the campfire and let's get living the family life of our dreams. Today I'm here with Chris Balme talking about tweens. Chris is an education leader and writer passionate about helping young people discover more of their human potential. As co-founder and head of School at Millennium School, a lab school in San Francisco, Chris helped pioneer new learning methods for middle schoolers based in developmental science. He then founded Argonaut, an online program to bring social-emotional learning to more students. And he now serves as the founding principal of Hakuba International School in Japan, developing learning approaches that foster human and environmental well-being. He also received the Ashoka Fellowship as a leading global changemaker in education and regularly speaks, trains, and writes for parents and teachers around the world. And of course, he's the author of the new book, Finding the Magic in Middle School. Chris talks a lot about how the season of parenting tweens and teens is an invitation to our own transformation. Quote, "Someone who is transforming is like a person on fire. If you spend enough time with them, you'll start to catch fire too. If you feel that heat, I want to invite you to join us in the Sage Family Village, where we explore these invitations in brave, creative, and supportive community together at sagefamily.com/village. All right, here we go. Blake Bowles, who joined me in episode 48 of this podcast to talk about teens, introduced me to Chris and his work as he knew it would resonate with me, and he was right. I read his book, Finding the Magic in Middle School, and loved it. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Really glad to be here.
Will you introduce yourself and share a bit about who you are and what you're passionate about?
Yes. So I have spent about 20 years now, which I can hardly even believe, working with middle schoolers. Started off somewhat accidentally as a student teacher and just got hooked on this age. And to me, the way that they are kind of the ultimate underdogs, treated, often as just kind of hormonal, difficult beings, and we're waiting for them to get older. But actually, it's such a fruitful time in life where you figure out so much of who you are. So to get to work with them, I find just super exciting. And now to have, so I guess I should explain more. I was a teacher, ran a nonprofit program working with middle schoolers, and then started my own middle school almost 10 years ago and got to be a middle school principal and try to design a really different kind of environment that's focused, more on their well-being first, and then going into academics with that foundation, and can say more about that. And then wrote this book earlier this year, Finding the Magic in Middle School, really to help parents and teachers see the age more positively and to have good research to back them up and know how to tap into what's really possible for this age.
That so sounds like our jam. And I love when I can find someone that is just like, these are my people. This is my season. I'm passionate about it. I'm all in. And then we can just sort of like bask in your glow for an hour and like soak up all the wisdom that we can.
Thank you. Well, I'm looking forward to learning too. And, these things are not ever part of any master plan. You just somehow end up sometimes in places where you're needed. I feel lucky.
Okay, so let's start with what is mainstream culture misunderstanding about tweens?
I think the biggest misunderstanding is actually underestimating them, that we think they're not capable of that much. I mean, you think of, for most of human history, when you got to what we now call middle school age, you were basically needing to do meaningful work to take care of your community and really stepping into adulthood. And now the same age, you have to raise your hand and ask to go to the bathroom. People call you hormonal constantly, which since when is that ever helpful to tell anyone that? We don't give them meaningful work for the most part. A lot of school can feel like a game. I think we've just kind of babied them in a way, and it doesn't really serve. So that's the first one I'd point to.
Yeah, I love that. I love when we can take like an evolutionary perspective on things. And when you look at kind of what their brains are wired for in this developmental season, by looking like way back in history or from, people who are living in non-industrialized places, we can see, like you said, that the children in this age group are engaged in the community in consequential, meaningful work that contributes, to the running of their village and their family. So they're allowed to pick up the bow and arrow. They're doing the meaningful stuff. It's not like, no, stay over here with the training wheels and just pretend, practice, prepare.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think especially at this age, you have to do things that are clearly of value for others in order to start feeling like a valuable person. Like you internalize it when it comes, through others' eyes. So if school doesn't feel real, if it feels too far away from the real world, then your success there may not really generate that sense of value. So you've got to find other ways.
Oh, that was a gem. I think, most of my audience too, not all, but a lot of my audience are homeschoolers and unschoolers. And so it was fun to like read your book kind of through that lens too, and see that, so people know, like it says, finding the magic in middle school, but like it all resonated with me. It was all completely applicable.
I'm so glad to hear that. Yes, I think so much of the book actually is about how to, if you're coming at it from a school perspective, it's how to break out of that perspective.
Yeah.
So you're already out. I hope it'll just add more ideas for that.
Okay, so what's going on developmentally in this season? What's happening in the brains of our tweens?
Yeah. So when I was, I got this really lucky period of about 3 years before we opened our kind of lab middle school in San Francisco. And in those 3 years, I got to spend time with middle schoolers and parents and researchers and school founders from all over the world, many different cultures. And it really helped me kind of zoom out of the things that we tend to worry about now and just get kind of a fresh perspective on what is happening developmentally and how do we work with those drives and never really try to fight them, because that doesn't go well. And I'll explain more why. But I sum it up around 3 questions. And these questions I'm going to say them in kind of an adult way, but I think these are the questions that middle schoolers are asking themselves. And you can trace practically any behavior back to one of these questions. So here goes. I'm ready. First one. Okay. So the first one is, who am I? And it's just the quest for your authentic identity. And for middle schoolers, what's different, compared to an elementary schooler is they can see the social world. They realize now that they're always being judged, and that's pretty terrifying. They realize that there are hierarchies for good or not good reasons. There are groupings and exclusion and inclusion. So that means they're not sure if they should reveal what they're actually feeling or who they actually think they are. But the safer the space they're in socially, the more they get to experiment and tinker toward an authentic identity versus a false self where you're copying something else. And with that authentic identity comes their actual power, like their resilience, their motivation to keep with something, even if it's not cool to other people, because you love it. So that's the first drive, is who am I? The second is, how do I connect? And that's obvious to anyone who's ever had a middle schooler or worked with them, that, I think you could say it's the most socially driven age of our entire lifespan. And even back like 100 years ago, Maria Montessori was writing about middle schoolers and saying, like, this is the time when we become social beings. And I think she's totally right. And now there's plenty of science, neuroscience to back that up. So anything that's about how do I relate, join groups, leave groups, solve interpersonal problems, this is developmentally one of their biggest needs and drives. And it's probably the best window, I think, in our lives to figure out those social identity questions, because your social brain has just turned on, but you haven't yet built your habits kind of about how you see yourself socially. So how do I connect? And then the final drive is, what will I contribute? And that's back to what we were saying before, that if you feel like you're just in a game or you're being babysat all day, doesn't feel like a real contribution. But when you're out there doing something that an objective adult, not your parents, can give you feedback on and thinks is cool or thinks is notable, that builds your sense of esteem and confidence, so much more than anything else. So who I am, how do I connect, and how do I contribute? I think that is what they're going for developmentally. And anything we do to set the conditions for them to answer those questions authentically helps them.
Yes. My experience with my own 3 kids right now, they are 17, 14, and 10. And when they were younger, that who am I question was almost under the umbrella of the family. So it was more like, we are blank. We are blank. Even when I would create the space for, here's what I believe. What do you believe? Or I look forward to seeing, what you come up with. They still very much, their brains kind of lived under that umbrella of we as a family unit. Then once they became tweens, that's when they started being able to really see that they are a distinct individual, that beginning of that really, that individuation on this next level starts to kick in. And so they start to see that I am connected to this family unit, and yet I am distinct and separate and individual, and I can belong to other things beyond, just this family unit. And how do I belong and how do I matter in these spaces? And, that was kind of my view, as at least my older 2 kind of made that transition.
That's it. Exactly. And as a parent, if we know that's coming and we don't have to resist it or take it personally of thinking, they're not as interested in me as they used to be. It's like, we can actually pat ourselves in the back and say, they have internalized us. They know what we're going to say. They know our values. They know what we love. Now they're ready for more, and they don't need to stop being connected to us, but their horizon is expanding.
Yeah. I think as parents too, it can be helpful to, some of us weren't given the space and the freedom to develop fully in this way when we were this age. And so as parents, we struggle with, again, being stuck in that family unit of, no, we believe this, or we do X, or we look like Y, right? So if parents can do that work of almost individuating themselves, kind of going back and reparenting their tween self of I believe this, and this works well for me, and this feels authentic for me. And I can be in loving, deep, meaningful connection with people who are not exactly the same as me, who don't believe the exact same things as me.
I think actually that is one of maybe the best gift you get for parenting a middle schooler. Is it's going to be intense at times, but if you take the opportunity, it's a chance to start growing again, maybe in a way that is different from how you have in a while, and being weirder and pulling some of your old hobbies or interests out of the closet to get to experiment with. I think that's a way you're kind of on the same page with them, is that's what they're up to. So you can be both on that track.
Yes, absolutely. And maybe it seems counterintuitive to some people, but my experience has been that the more freedom I give them to individuate, and the more I dive deeper into myself and grow myself in these ways, the more connected we are, and the more influence I have with them, as opposed to control, because they know I'm not trying to control them. And I give them that space to be authentic and to grow and to stumble and try things on, that then they still come to me with their questions. And when I say something, they actually take it in and it actually matters to them.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. If you were resisting that, then they would spend all of their energy pushing back and getting stuck in that dynamic. But when you're welcoming that, then they actually see you as a guide versus, a boss that they're trying to, push away.
Yes. Okay, let's talk about learning. How do tweens learn best? We talk about a lot about learning on this podcast, and there's some stuff that's specifically going on, for them in this stage. So based on all of your experience working with all these tweens and working with them in educational settings in particular, how does this group learn?
So 2 things I would point to. One is that they are hyper social learners. And I want to say that that's even true for introverts. So I'm a super introvert, and it was even probably more so in middle school, but I was still very socially oriented. So introvert or extrovert, their growth comes socially. And if they're more introverted, they might need some more structured ways to be social. They don't necessarily want to be thrown into kind of a free-for-all social situation. But whether it's, learning around projects, learning in teams, being pushed, gently to take on different roles so that they're getting to experiment with different identities. Social learning means you're using that developmental social drive, to support learning versus, having to try to tell them to be quiet and stop talking to your friends, which is, that's a great way to have a battle.
That's where the good stuff is.
Yeah, exactly. So first is social. And then the other is that it has to feel relevant. If middle schoolers, sometimes they want to be baby, but if we talk to them like they're really elementary schoolers and can't do things in the world, that is just the fastest way to piss them off, I think, in general. So they want to feel like, if you're asking me to do this, it's because it actually matters. Like someone cares about this. And I think that's the measure. It's like, does someone in the outside world beyond our family, some quote unquote real adults, think that this problem is a serious problem, or this is a really interesting thing that you're working on? And if it has that relevance, then they're much more likely to be motivated.
Yeah. Just like a really practical example that my kids like participate in sailing. And one of the things where I love to just like sit back and watch kind of the magic happen is that like they're responsible for the boats. And like we have to get all these boats to different regattas like around the region, and kind of just like encouraging the parents to like, no, let's just like let's just give them the space to figure it out. Like they have to figure out like which cars the tow hitches line up to, how to get all the boat. They load all the boats themselves, like who can get where can the spots come in? I mean, that's something that's physical and kind of practical, but there's so much learning that comes from that. They have to communicate with each other. They have to be using their bodies. They have to do a lot of thinking ahead. And it really matters. If they attach one of these trailers wrong, we're crashing.
Yeah, exactly. I love that. Yeah. I mean, one of my favorite projects of all time with middle school, I talked about this in the book, is this tiny house challenge where middle schoolers were asked to design a tiny house that could be mass produced to create more housing stock, because that's a big challenge here in San Francisco. They had a strict budget, a whole bunch of parameters like the insulation value of the house. And so that all would be interesting. But then the key thing was the final presentation was to a panel of legit experts. So they had, an architect, a homeless rights person, civil attorney. They were the ones who were giving feedback. And that just totally changed the game. Then they felt like they were taken seriously. They didn't feel like their teachers were kind of both guide and judge, but were just purely there to support them in creating something that would impress this outside audience.
Oh, that's so cool. I think we're going to talk more about kind of what an ideal middle school looks like, but I know that those opportunities can be hard to find. Like it can be hard to, collaboratively and socially have these meaningful, I know as a homeschooling parent, like I've tried to work very hard to create those opportunities, and they are very challenging to find.
Agreed. Yeah. And I think hopefully homeschooling parents have more latitude, as if you can find, so many of the homeschooling families I know are so well networked that, you're good at identifying an adult who has expertise in a given area. And that kind of matchmaking between, that project, for example, with the tiny house came about because students were talking about seeing homeless people on the streets and feeling at a loss for how to respond emotionally or practically. So that got us thinking, even though we were in a school environment, like, who do we know who has wisdom on this? And then the matchmaking magic can start. So
that's amazing. Mentors. That's like one of the things I talk about all the time. That is like one of those like secret sauces of really awesome, like natural learning is finding, which is basically this podcast, right? I find people who are super passionate about something very niche. And then we like create this conversation together. And that's like really what I try to do with my kids. Like, I'm super passionate about, bats. Okay, let's find like the person who like lives, eats, and breathes, goes out on expeditions in the wild and studies them. And like, what can we do? How can we, we can build bat boxes, like trying to, mentors are incredible and amazing. And if anyone like is looking for a direction to go in, I think that's a fabulous recommendation.
And one of my favorite ways to structure that is with an apprenticeship. I so wish that there were more apprenticeships out there. And I've spent a lot of time in my own path so far helping to create apprenticeship programs. And I know that word may kind of connect to just the trades, but I think it can be much more than that. Essentially any profession. I mean, I've seen students apprentice with police officers to pilots to software engineers to every possible role. And it's just like, it's mentorship, but with enough structure that it's less awkward and also kind of connects the dots sometimes for kids that, oh, this particular academic subject is actually used or maybe not. They can get the legit real information about it. So yeah, I really hope more people take up the challenge of creating apprenticeships. It's not always as hard as it might seem.
Oh, that is so cool. Okay, how can we best support their development? What can we do?
Okay, number one advice, I mentioned this a bit earlier, is just to be weird. That they need adults who, I know. I feel like I've checked that one also. Yeah, I mean, I think everyone is weird. There are no normal people, but there are people who pretend. And those people probably have a harder time creating trust with middle schoolers, as middle schoolers are so good, middle school and after, you're so good now at perceiving and you pick up all the subtle signals. But middle schoolers, because that skill is so new, aren't always good at interpreting or knowing why someone is sending me one signal with body language, but saying something that is very different. Yeah. So the more you align those two, the more they'll trust you. And they'll also feel, hopefully, a sense of permission that they can be weird, because they're definitely weird, as we all are. They're messy and unfinished and testing identities sometimes like by the minute. So I always just try to emphasize this with parents that, if there are things that you've kept to yourself, whether it's, emotions that you normally hide or parts of your story or even a conflict with a friend or a stress at work that you have been thinking because your kids have been younger, like, I don't want to bring this out when they're around. Maybe just 1 degree more is possible. It doesn't mean you have to throw open every door in your minds, but to share a bit more of your true self, I think that is such a gift for them.
Yeah, even in small, like everyday ways. If your kid says, how was work? And where normally you might say fine, you could say, I really struggled to move through a conversation peacefully with a coworker. Like it really was hard. That was hard today. That was the real work of today.
Exactly. And that also helps, I think a classic challenge parents have with middle schoolers is difficulty creating good conversations. And that honesty and specificity in your own sharing gives them a lot to react to and can start to make a more interesting conversation.
Well said. Okay. Anything else that we can be doing to support their development other than being weird? I love that one.
So I guess the next one I would say is to focus on their sense of belonging first. So there's a lot of research, I'm sure you've seen all this, that if we don't feel that we belong, even just with 1 or 2 people, that can be such a threatening experience that it's hard to be ourselves, learn to our potential, or really almost anything. So it doesn't mean that they have to have a big social network at all. But if your child doesn't have at least one, stable friendship or group, I think helping to support that happening, maybe by exposing them to different possible activities or places where they can form that, I would start there.
Yeah.
And then, maybe last thing I'd say is that because they're such keen social learners, they are constantly experiencing new social situations, like a conflict with a friend, or I was just talking to a student who's stuck in between 2 friends who are trying to pull him into their conflict. And this is all new territory for them. It really helps them to have a space where they can process that. So that could be with a mentor. It could be an advisory style group. It could be scouts. There are, many places, but to have some like a facilitated peer group where you're with people the same age, but there's someone who's maybe a little older helping to make that space kind of safe, where you can bring up these questions that you really want to ask, but, typing it into Google is not always going to be the fruitful path.
Yeah. I remember when I was in middle school, in seventh grade. I had a teacher. Her name was Mrs. Woods. I never had any teachers that like I loved or felt particularly inspiring or anything, maybe in part why I homeschool. But I had this one teacher who, for the first like 20 minutes of class once a week, we would just sit in a circle and she would ask a question and everyone could basically share a feeling, based on whatever her prompt was. And I remember one time there was this girl who was the school bully. Like she was horribly, heinously mean to people. And she just like started crying about how like she was a foster kid and she had no one in the world and everyone who was close to her hurt her and all these things. And I remember being in seventh grade thinking, wow, this teacher took 20 minutes a week. and this girl is now like showing up to class and answering questions. And that's all it took just to create that little bit of like processing space.
It's such a deep human need to have a space where you can be honest. And, even separate from talking about middle schoolers, I think we need it as parents. That, I think often when we have, really young kids, we start to find new connections, other people who are new moms or dads, but sometimes that's drifted or those relationships sometimes have become more superficial in how we talk about our kids by the time we get to middle school. So if we can find or create that where even just 2 or 3 parents where you can be brutally honest about this is my experience of parenting right now, or this is what I'm being challenged by, or this was the awesome thing that happens. It's worth everything to have that kind of honest space.
Yes, I have like an online membership, which is sort of like the closest I could get, called The Village, which is like me attempting to create that space for parents where we can come together once a month. We have like a live group Zoom call where we can just like talk things out. I answer questions, and then there's like a like question, comment, answer kind of thing all the time, the rest of the time. And it's definitely like it helps to meet that need for a lot of people, which I saw, like, oh, this is a need. Like we need to come together around some of this stuff and be able to talk about it honestly and openly and just feel connected to other people who are doing similar work.
It's amazing how, one conversation a month like that can just lighten your load for all of the ups and downs that come before the next one.
Yes. Okay. How does the parent-child relationship shift in these tween years?
Yeah. So something I talk about in the book is this cognitive bias called the anchoring effect. And maybe I'll start there. So the anchoring effect just means that we all have a tendency to value information we get first compared to later information. So that can explain first impressions, why those are so important. But think about it with your kids. When they're entering middle school and they're probably starting to individuate and want more responsibility or freedom, perhaps, but all of our experience of them is in the past. So without meaning to, we are going to treat them as younger than they actually are, unless we're really aware of this. We're going to remember when we would not let them cross the street alone, when they want to take the subway or the bus or whatever. So I think first, just being aware of that helps to realize that if we're in our comfort zone as parents, we're probably holding them back. We're probably a bit lagging. And it doesn't mean, they might tend to overestimate their abilities. So it doesn't mean meeting them totally there, but there's an in-between. Yeah. And just in general, I think with young kids, it's tempting to feel like a boss, even though it's probably not the optimal way to parent, I think, even for young kids, but it's easy to feel that way because we're so much bigger, older, smarter. But by the time they reach this age, they're on such an epic adventure. Someone on an adventure does not need a boss with them. That's not the right companion. You need something closer to a guide. And you still have authority and you're still extremely important to them, but trying to control them is not going to create a good relationship. So shifting from boss to guide, it's the easiest thing to say, hardest thing to do, but that's the direction, I think.
Yeah, I think a lot of parents struggle with toddlers and teens because those are the two really developmental stages where control-based parenting fails you.
Yes.
it won't work. It does not
exactly
work.
The same thing. Yes.
Yes. So this tween stage gives you a really beautiful transition, like if you've been parenting that way, to begin softening and opening and getting curious and, getting less judgmental on yourself and your kids, and just sort of opening and softening to that, like shifting and a bit more of the leveling of that power dynamic, in the sense that even if your brain wants to think of it like, I will have more influence on my child if I, instead of telling them what to do, invite them into invite them to join in collaboration with me about something, to get curious about what ideas they have about it. If they have a problem, rather than trying to solve it, just saying, man, that sounds really hard. What ideas do you have about how to get through that, and just sort of like, oh yeah, that's a really good idea. Did you think about X? Like, oh yeah, if that happens, what could you do? Like just questions, just ask more questions than making more statements. I mean, even that in and of itself, it's like a really simplified way of getting at what we're talking about.
Totally agreed. Yeah, I think those two phases, the early childhood and early adolescence, have so much in common. And I know that can sound demeaning to early adolescence. I don't mean it that way. It's more that those are neurologically the two peak times of brain growth in our entire lives. Yeah. So that means it's intense. That means change is rapid, and you have to see things developmentally to make sense of it all. So I agree. The two hardest parenting times are probably the chances for us to grow the most also.
Yes. It's funny because you can kind of see it when they're toddlers, in that sometimes they will try to run faster than their feet can go yet. Like, and they can coordinate the movement of their feet. And if we can think of that, like, and it kind of apply that to tweens, it's really the same thing happening, where their brains are growing so quickly and just so rapid fire expanding. And it takes the rest of them a little time to catch up. So like you said, sometimes they might overestimate, what they're capable of and fall flat on their face. Same with toddlers. Like, they think, I can jump off this log, and they fall down. And that's okay. Hold the space for that. You can, catch them. You can help them up when they fall, whatever, all that. Yes. Be there, cheer them on, point out things that they may not have seen. Like, hey, we have this bridge. We live on an island. And at low tide, when it totally drains out in the summer, you can see that there's actually a really tall mound of soil, which makes it so that you really can't jump off the bridge without potential life-threatening injury. So, like, just pointing that out, hey, look on this side of the bridge. You can't tell when the water level is up, but there is really high soil level there. Like, so the water is nowhere near as deep as you think it is, and then they'll point out, oh yeah, on the other side though, look, there's like a dip, that from on the other side. I'm like, yeah, there is a dip on the other side. So even just pointing that stuff out, like, so where do you think the deepest point on the bridge would be? Just kind of asking those questions, like, as opposed to just, no, we don't jump off bridges ever. That's not safe. That's not going to help them learn to make like safe choices for themselves if you're just always telling them what to do.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like if you were going on a big, wilderness trip and you could hire a guide, you would want a guide like you just described, who's kind of pointing out, note that would be very dangerous, but here's another option to have the same experience, versus just, blanket restrictions. Yeah. Oh, yeah, I agree completely.
Yes. Okay, so paint a picture for us of an ideal middle school. So like I said, a lot of my audience are homeschoolers. Even homeschoolers, though, their kids will try school or leave school. A lot of our audience, their kids participate in various educational, hybrid, creative, non-traditional options. So I actually, when I said I was going to have this conversation with you, lots of people asked this question. They wanted to know, like, okay, if I'm like designing an agile learning center, if I could do whatever I wanted, what should I do? What would really nurture the body, mind, and soul of a tween?
Oh, thank you for this question. And I'm going to try not to talk for an hour about it. So
Please,
many ideas.
Go ahead. I've got tea.
So, okay. I mean, the first thing I would say, and this is going to be more general, then I'll give some more specific suggestions, is that I think this is always true, but especially at this age, the adults are the real curriculum. So whether you're a teacher or a homeschool parent, you are the curriculum. The way you see yourself, the way you see other people, the way the mindsets you hold about how humans grow, that is what is being transmitted. And, if you ask most people what they remember about middle school, they don't often speak about specific subjects, but it'll be this relationship or the way this teacher treated me. It's that kind of relational quality that really gets sent across loud and clear. So to me, that's a reason that we should get to work on ourselves more when we have kids or students this age, because that's directly supporting how much they can grow. So that's maybe the big umbrella idea. And then I'll get a little more specific. So with Millennium School, a school I helped to start in San Francisco, we tried lots of experiments about how to be a really different kind of learning space. And I think there are two that I would point to that I think really worked. Plenty of interesting mess ups along the way as well. The first one is having advisory or something like that as kind of the heart of the school. And I think this can really apply in non-school environments as well. But like I was mentioning before, some kind of space where you can be the most honest of maybe anywhere in your whole life. Small group of kids, maybe with one adult who's guiding, that's consistent over time, like even if possible over the entire middle school stretch. See each other at least once a week. And like you were saying with that story of your 7th grade teacher, just, light prompts, not lectures, not heavy curriculum, just enough to kind of source what's on their minds and make it safe for them to hear each other and respond in comments. There's so much. I can only imagine if I had had that space in middle school, what I really wanted to ask about, about friendships or how to ask someone out, or I didn't have anyone that I could talk to about that who I would believe or even feel safe enough to really ask. So it's such a gift to have a space like that. And it generates a sense of belonging and connection. So that's one. And the other key ingredient, from that experience here in San Francisco is to orient around projects rather than academic subjects.
Yeah, project-based learning.
Project-based learning.
Shout out.
Yeah. So that is, easier said than done. And yes, it's a kind of educational jargon, but I mean, the essence is back to that idea of relevance. Adults don't do English for 1 hour and then history for 1 hour, blah, blah, blah. You've heard this before. Kids know that. Middle schoolers are easily savvy enough to realize that. So they are not going to be fully motivated if that's what their day looks like, whether that's a homeschool version or a school version. It needs to feel like this is a real world problem that other adults actually care about and maybe even struggle with. And maybe they don't have the answer either. And I can do something original, and it's going to be presented to people in the real world, not just my parents, friends, teachers, etc. That just changes their motivation completely. Kind of lets you be on the same team as them also.
Yeah. My kiddo, when she was, I don't even remember how old she was. We needed like a writing sample to meet some like legal homeschooling requirement. And I kind of invited her to, okay, you have to write something, like, so that's the requirement. So what would be the most meaningful to you? Like, what can you make a difference with? Like, because really that's like, my kids have witnessed that, like, I'm a writer and I write books and I write posts and whatever. And I don't write for the sake of writing or to like get a grade or even to learn the skill of writing. I write because I feel like what I have to say is important and it helps people and it matters. So what do you care about? What do you want to make a difference in? She ended up writing a letter to a politician, and we talked all about how to frame that writing so that you're as convincing as you can be, to get your point of view across. And she made a connection with like a state representative, and she went and like handed him the letter, and he agreed to hand it to the person who was really pushing the opposite side of this issue that she cared a lot about, that affected people she cared about. All of this incredible learning through, just sort of creating that space for it, setting up an invitation for it, just kind of like encouraging her a little bit. What do you care about? Like, what do you think you have something important to say on? And okay, let's do that.
And that's a great example of how it didn't take a complicated prompt on your part. Just be like, so what do you care about? And, then I'll support you in getting that in some structure that this requirement, demands of you. Yeah, I love that.
Okay, you said you like tried some things that didn't work out so well, and I'm so curious now. What did you try that didn't work out so well?
Oh, yeah. I mean, several things. One that I often think about is we really wanted to do PE differently. And I know this may be a very different situation for homeschool families, but I always felt in middle school like PE was more closer to a traumatic experience than anything like health generating.
Yes.
And it could be so much more. And also the way schools are structured, we have kids sitting for way too long.
Yeah.
We need to be far more embodied and allow them to move. And so we decided we would create a PE program based on Aikido. So we thought that would be a really interesting, maybe unexpected way to access some of that. And for about a third of the students, it was a really, really beautiful experience. And I think for the rest, we got carried away as adults thinking like, oh, this is the most beautiful and kind of like deep, important art that is about our relationships and our physical wellness. And the 2/3 of students were like, not into it. So that was just one of those humbling things of realizing like, it's great to be passionate about something like this, but it does not mean you should impose that on everyone needing to do the same thing.
Beautiful lesson. And I have so been there as a parent thinking, oh my gosh, this invitation that I'm going to set up, it's incredible.
It's going to blow their minds. Yeah.
It is going to change the world and make them a better person. And oh my God, this is like, I've read all the studies. This is going to be amazing. And then like I set it up and they're like, no, I'm good. Like, no, thank you.
Exactly. Yeah.
Gotta remember, don't get attached. So whether or not they pick up that invitation, that's up to them.
Seriously, just to trust, like you put it out there, it has been registered in their brain. Maybe 30 years from now, that will bear fruit, but do not fight it if they're not into it now.
Yes. Maybe I planted a seed, that will bloom in the future.
Could be. Yeah.
Oh man, I've so been there. That advisory thing that you mentioned, Sky, when she did Not Back to School Camp with Blake Bowles, she said that was like all the advisory that happened there was life-changing, incredible, amazing. She said that was absolutely fantastic. Like, and when she would call and talk to us, like that was often what she would talk about. So just to add a little anecdotal evidence to support what you're talking about there, she said it was incredible.
Yeah. I mean, at Millennium, they start off their middle school adventure with a week in the woods with their advisory, and then they meet every single weekday for the next 3 years. And so they get really, really close. They go through ups and downs. They have tension. They work through it. And I can say, so at Millennium, every student gives a short speech at graduation, and probably 80% of them are about their advisory. Like, that's the group that they went on this adventure with, and that's who they made meaning with. And they've got stories about, the time they got on the wrong bus and had the most disastrous field trip, and stories about, their advisor and how they got to see that person as actually a human and not just a teacher. And it's so valuable for them to feel like they are accompanied on this wild adventure of being an adolescent.
That's amazing. And it's funny too, because when I look back, like in hindsight, when I reflect on some of the programs that we've participated in that actually felt really good, a soul affirming kind of way, that is like one of those ingredients that's kind of always present in those programs. Like there was this forest school that we participated in that was amazing, that we used to live closer to. And there was a component of that sitting circle situation, at the gathering point, and all that kind of stuff would happen. And you're with the same group for years. And it was, while we didn't get to stay with them for years, that made an impression on me that, oh, this is like really special. Like this is something really special. And that was definitely one of the ingredients. And like I said, just reflecting back, all the programs that I felt were really special kind of had that ingredient.
It's like a kind of emergent wisdom that just has popped up everywhere in the world that, oh, wow, small, trusting groups that can be honest with each other really help us do this human living thing. So, yes, I hope more of them exist.
Okay, what are some common challenges in this season of development, and how can we shift to better meet them?
One I started to mention before, which is that middle school is this time of social awakening. So you can now see all of these dynamics, but it takes time to interpret them accurately. So your perception is leagues ahead of your ability to interpret. And the same with things like the words you can use. If you're in a conflict with someone and you're a 7th grader, sometimes you can use pretty intense, hard-hitting adult words in that conflict, and you don't fully appreciate the weight of them but you've picked them up because you have those great perception skills. So that gap between what you can perceive and what you can actually interpret and make use of is, I think, one of the hardest things about this age. So to me, that says first, we should give them a lot of grace, that they are on the steepest learning curve, figuring out the social world and how to exist among other people who are also figuring it out. So they need space to process. I think we shouldn't shame social conflict when it happens. They are earnestly trying to figure out how to be around people, and there are going to be so many mistakes along the way. And ideally, we treat those as like the best learning opportunities. How you figure out to understand your own emotions and maybe repair things with someone else might be the most important thing you take away from this whole journey of middle school. So that could be through advisory spaces, through mentorships, through social emotional learning, that kind of thing. So that's, I think, one of the classic challenges. I guess maybe another we also spoke to a bit is just the parent-child relationship changes so much that even when you're expecting it, it can still throw us for a loop. And one of the simple things I like to share with parents and try to practice myself is, middle schoolers, they spend a lot of energy trying to read faces. And there's actually interesting research about how their ability to read faces is so much greater in middle school than elementary. And also the emotional reactions they have to people's expressions are much intensified compared to elementary. So sometimes, well-meaning parents, we really want to connect. We're kind of getting in their face, asking them questions, coming from such a good place, but it can feel really demanding and like they're being interviewed. So I think something that can really help is to really be side by side and to find interesting things to comment on together. And some people call that the third thing. It's like, you've got parent and child, and your third thing might be a movie, and you're commenting on the characters and their relationship. And all of a sudden there's a chance to have a conversation about relationships that you could never generate if you sat them down face to face, or a puzzle you're doing together, or you're, driving along and commenting on what you're seeing. But just as an example of new ways to find connection, that it helps to have some of those in mind so that you're not totally thrown for a loop when they start shifting how they want to relate to you.
Yeah, the third thing can be helpful. Like, it can be like you're baking a dessert. I mean, it doesn't need to be even anything profound. Like you said, you're watching a show, watching a movie, but stuff comes out in those times. And even if it doesn't, I notice, like, even if there's nothing about my kid's life that they talk about while we're baking those muffins, they feel closer and more connected and more safe to take risks in other spaces in their life and less affected by hard things in other spaces of their life when we have that hour baking muffins together and we're just talking about muffins. And of course, oftentimes other stuff does come up, while we're doing that, and it just comes out.
Yeah, it's credit in the bank. And then when they have a hard moment, they're more likely to be willing to open up over the next muffin baking experience or whatever it might be.
I must be hungry for muffins. I'm really leaning into that.
Sounds pretty good, actually.
What are some like mistakes or pitfalls that you really see parents falling into? I know the coming alongside them, being more of a guide. Are there any specific things that we should watch out for or not do or do differently?
I think a lot of middle school parents get strung out around academics more than they need to. So, often it's the time when the playfulness of elementary school starts to seem behind you, and oh my God, there's serious stuff coming up, and maybe entrance tests or things, levels of education that are not going to be easy to enter, that you can't just create on your own. And sometimes we just really lose our parenting values for a little while when we first feel that pressure. It's like, okay, I was being creative before, but now it's time to get down to business. And all of a sudden we think it's okay to, go back to drilling them or something that maybe we experienced as kids. So I think one antidote to that is to realize this is the best social development window of our lives. So figuring out how to be around people and to be on teams and to be a friend and to repair a friendship and set boundaries with others, that will serve you so well in life. And of course, there are mountains of research about how your emotional intelligence outweighs pure cognitive IQ and your even directly career success, let alone happiness. So if you realize that's really more what's at stake in these years, and don't worry, keep giving them interesting problems to work on or inviting them to find them. You don't have to drill them, in advanced algebra for it to have been a good middle school experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. For me personally, I know it's very active work. Like since my oldest two have chosen to go to school, to not get very triggered by the grades because of course, how I was raised was very different, and grades were everything. And I was severely punished if I got anything less than an A. And when I got all A's, like I was, the trophy that was held up, and like so many of my own and just kind of recognizing that that's my stuff and that's my work, and to not put any of that on them is important and ongoing. And I think the self-driven child, I'm sure you're familiar with them. Like they've been on the podcast twice. They're fantastic. Their work is fantastic. And for me, that's been hugely helpful in terms of my kids and schooling, is that for example, my kid who just started high school this year, at first was asking lots of what ifs, like, what if I get like a C in this class? How would you feel about that? Like I would feel okay with it. Okay. Sounds like it's okay then.
I love that.
Just very lots of what ifs, just to feel out how does this work? Like, what's the dynamic between you and me in terms of like who owns what is mine to own? What is mine to fully grab hold of and take just full ownership of? And then where are you gonna step in? And so just to have that reassuring reminder that I step in when there could be imminent harm to you or to someone else or to the environment. Just like when you were a toddler, that's the only time when I will supersede over your freedom and autonomy. And it's the same with school. So as long as you're not hurting yourself or someone else or the environment, then you do you.
And it's such a good point that you have to try to catch when your own needs are actually what's driving things.
Yeah.
A mentor of mine told me once that, if someone brings you a problem and your emotional reaction is bigger than their emotional reaction, then you realize this is your need speaking, and you're no longer there just to support them. And my goodness, that is so hard as a parent to catch. I feel that really keenly in my own life, but it's a good effort. It's worth any time you can discover that you've made it really more your own thing.
Yes. And I think that's one of those things about this age too, is that they are stepping into a greater capacity for ownership of their stuff. So when they're a toddler and they're saying, I want to jump, and you're saying, okay, let's see. I noticed that there's some ice over here. Did you see that it's really slippy on that spot? Oh, okay, I'll jump this way. Great. So, the space that they have to really own stuff is smaller. And when they become tweens is really when that space gets significant. They can actually have ownership over far more of their lives, experiences and choices, to where you don't need to step in to, protect to ensure that there's no harm to themselves, someone else, or the environment, the world, right? And we have to define that and always be really clear on how we define that. For example, getting a B in math, that's not harm. No one's hurt in the making of that grade. So
Exactly.
Just being really clear where that line is, where you will step over their ownership, because at this age they want to own more.
Exactly. And then they get to come to you for consultation, and they're so much more open to talking with you if they don't think this is going to trigger you to suddenly, make their problem worse in a way.
Yes.
So it opens that relationship.
Yeah, my kids' friends have talked to me about there's this, when they post the test, it's in a Google form, then you can see all the answers if you push these buttons, and I don't know how I feel about that. I did it. It was fine. I don't think I'm really learning anything from doing that stupid test anyway. I don't know. What do you think? So that they would even like be able to feel safe enough to enter into conversation with me about that means that they trust that I'm not going to stomp over their ownership of this decision and this experience. And I think that really is like the gift right there.
That is gold. Those are some of my favorite moments when a middle schooler brings you like a legitimate, like ethical or friendship question.
Yes.
It's like, wow, thank you so much for trusting me to share that. That's a leap.
Yes.
What a sign of success.
Okay, the show notes can be found at sagefamily.com/podcast82, where you can also subscribe and get future show notes sent right to your inbox. So now you get to tell us about your favorite resources for people to dive deeper into this topic. And of course, it's got to be all your stuff too.
Thank you. Well, there's so many good ones, but thank you for that opportunity. So my book, Finding the Magic in Middle School, written for parents and teachers, I hope will be helpful. I also am active on Instagram at Chris Balme, and also have a newsletter called Growing Wiser, where I share research and thoughts on what it means to raise or teach this magical and strange age of early adolescence. So I hope some of those will be useful.
Yeah, you have a 50 essential experiences for adolescents post that I'm going to link in the show notes too, because I thought that was really, really good. Like especially for homeschooling families out there that are kind of hungry for some specifics. So what really would be good for them? Like where should I direct my like resources and time and energy? It's like a great, kind of like list of ingredients that I thought was really inspiring and helpful and cool. So thank you for creating that. And I'm going to link to that too.
Thank you. That has been such a fun project of just asking now hundreds of people, like, what actually mattered about middle school? What did you start then that still sticks with you and maybe gives you something positive, even maybe years later? And so it's everything from people talking about the first time they kept a diary all the way to, a time I joined a protest or started my own business. So yeah, there's some great things on there sourced from lots of people reflecting.
Oh, Chris, thank you so much for joining us to talk about these kids that are so often misunderstood. I'm so glad we had you here today to kind of clear some of that up and share your passion and your expertise. I'm such like a research nerd, and I love that your book gave me a little bit of that, and this conversation gave us a little bit of that. It's smooth enough that it was easily digestible. So thank you. I hope
so. I can get carried away with the research for sure, but thank you so much. This was really fun.